For those of you that don't know me, my name is George Benaroya. During the day, I work as a CFO. I started my career after my MBA. I went to work for Procter & Gamble for about 8 years, then at Tetra Pak for about 12 years, then at Nivea for 3 years. And for the last 9 years, I've been working in private equity. Now, one thing that I do once per week is something that I love, and that is to teach this class. If you guys watch TV, you hear when, the Oscars or the Emmys, NYU, NYU, NYU. So you may think that we're actors and actresses, but we're not. That's a different school. It's called TISH. This is the School of Professional Studies, and these are real students that you're seeing today. Maybe I'll explain better. Candice, would you share the screen again, please? Let me see if mine works. And if not, I'll ask you. No, you'll have to, would you go to the next one? The next slide. So the first day, what students do is they pick a company, any company that they want. I tell them, don't pick anyone on the right-hand side because we already had speakers from these companies. And last semester, they picked CVS. And that is when I reach out to Dr. Yazbeck, and now he's joining us. On the next slide, we explain what we actually do in class, right? So the first decision that they have to make is about headcount. How many people are we going to hire on a global basis next year? And this is how Anuja, Daria, Liora, and Trint went about it, right? The number and the reason why. Now, one thing that we say in this class is that there are no right or wrong numbers. The whole idea is how to use numbers to persuade others of making the right decision. On the next slide, you see, what do we do when we don't have enough product for everyone? It happens in CPG companies. It could happen, for example, that we don't have enough plastic gloves during COVID, or tests for COVID and so on. And what you see on the left-hand side, both you guys and me, is how people reacted before the pandemic and now. And what you will see is that they were basically split, right? They said, well, we will give some to new clients, some to all clients. But something that is really interesting is about how we humans reason is that on the right-hand side, you see that students prioritize loyalty and giving these products to all clients. On the next slide, we see how students are actually going about it. So this is how C went about, choosing whether to give it to all clients or new clients. And then on the next slide, you see pricing, right? So there is inflation, and what we learned how to do is how to do a price increase on a global basis. This is what Faid did for Kering. He went through each one of the brands and he figured how much do we need to increase prices. And it was 5% nominal, but a full year impact of 3% because he's choosing to delay strategically some price increases. Now, on the next slide, you will see someone who is not in my class. So what we learn also is what to do when clients react like her, right? And what you would see on the next slide is one major retailer, is a French retailer comparable to Walmart in Europe. And on my first job at P&G, they did to us what they did last year to Pepsi. So this was an article in the Wall Street Journal, and it's reading that they are not, letting Pepsi products be on the shelves because Pepsi increased prices. So what we learn in class is how to do a price increase to prevent that from happening. And then on the next slide, you see how one of our students, Lynn, who is also the person who did a video that we'll show you later, went about communicating the price increase to clients. In this case, it was for Trader Joe's. On the next slide, you see what happens at the end of the semester. So it's great to have all this theory, but it's much, much better to have someone who is really making these decisions to tell us how do they do it. And today, we're very happy to have with us Dr. Cesar Yazbeck to talk about it. Would you stop sharing the screen? Thanks, guys. I like to make introductions more at a personal level, not with titles and so on. And something that is real nice about Dr. Yazbeck is that he had a great career as a doctor. back home. And instead of just complaining about the problems that we have sometimes with patients or with doctors, he chose to go to, say, the belly of a beast and started working at McKinsey, first in Dubai, then in New York. Then he went on to work at CVS. And his whole point was about how could we make our business, from a patient to a doctor better, more enjoyable for the patient and more useful for everyone. And that is why we're really, really delighted to have Dr. Cesar Yazbeck with us today.
Thank you so much.
And Cesar, I leave it to you if you want to say any quick words or anything that you would like to share.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just start by saying thank you for having me here in this session, and I'm excited for the questions. Personally, as I've kind of like reflected on, I think this session has been also like a good way for me to reflect on the past 10 to 12 years of my career. And as I thought of it, both as someone that moved to the US as an international student and got set up, and I think Dr. George, you also mentioned that a share of your students are internationals. It really made me want to be part of this experience, but also share a bit more of how to navigate the journey as an expat trying to establish your roots in the US. And so thank you for the vote of confidence, excited for the conversation, and look forward to the discussion.
Great, excellent. And we have, many questions related to that. So what I always do is I, invite all students to ask questions. I ask only one, but the idea is for them to have a chance. And, the question that I ask, and typically will come to the front to make sure that the mic is working well, is who are hardest to please, McKinsey clients or patients? Now, 60%, right? 60% is the number of patients who come to see the doctor with research that they did in AI. And what we know across the world is that some doctors are annoyed because they don't have enough time to answer all those questions. Now, there's also 60% of people like me who are basically annoyed when, McKinsey or the BCG consultants come with all these questions because, we have to do our day of work. And in addition to that, respond to all these questions. So, doctor, if you had to compare patients to people doing their job, who is it hardest to please?
I find this question really interesting because if I were to be honest, both are really hard to please. So it's really tough. But I'll maybe look at this in the vantage point of where is the question coming from? And I think that's important because if you think about how McKinsey ends up in a specific organization, an organization will typically identify an objective or a problem that they want to resolve. They'll pull in a consultant in order to answer this question. And then that consultant's job is to figure out what is the discovery journey they need to go on to get to the answer. Now, why do I outline this? Because it is structurally very different than the journey of a patient going to a doctor, right? And an organization, when you pull in consultants, you have certainty around why you're pulling them in. You have uncertainty around the answers they're going to bring in. And the benefit of answering the questions goes to the company because the answer is better, right? But ultimately, the goal is, whether it's profit, cost reduction, optimization, restructuring, it's a business objective. When a patient goes to a doctor, the experience is so different because you research your symptoms, you have uncertainty around what you are feeling, right? You are coming to the doctor not to ask questions so that you can give them a better answer. You are a human condition that, maybe has symptoms, maybe is not feeling as well as usual. And you're kind of bringing these questions towards not the objective, but the human side of things, right? How can I alleviate the anxiety or stress that I feel around my condition? And so if I were to kind of think of hard as in, which one is harder to convince the person to answer the questions, I would say it's definitely harder to convince an employee to answer McKinsey's questions than to convince a doctor to answer a patient's question. Because as doctors, the core of our mission is to really not only treat the body, but provide the patient with the human experience of what healthcare is. And so answering their questions, despite them getting more and more as they chat GPT their symptoms, is really around creating a human experience that pushes patients to want to engage with the healthcare system. And for them next time to come back to the same doctor, get that continuity of care, get that like better, more comprehensive health experience. And so if I were to kind of be very simplistic in the answer, I would say it's definitely harder to answer McKinsey consultants' questions because I stand to benefit from the outcome, and so I am willing to forego it. Maybe it's the organization that's willing to forego it. But as a doctor, I feel an obligation to always be present and thoughtful in the experience that I give my patients so that this really existential moment for them. Sometimes it can be something as simple as a cold, sometimes something as complex as cancer care, is one where they feel seen as a human, not solved as a problem. I don't know if that resonates.
Yeah, it makes sense. Thank you, Cesar.
Hi, Mr. Yazbeck. Thank you so much for being here to answer our questions today. So my question is related to the application of the 80-20 principle. So when Vilfredo Pareto stared at Italy's land records in 1906 and saw 20% of people owned 80% of the land, and this had nothing to do with business efficiency back then, but then jumped to the 1940s and quality expert Joseph Duran grabs that weird statistic and renames it the 80-20 rule and says 20% of the problems cause 80% of the headaches, so we should focus there to fix everything. McKinsey later turned that into their Bible. So as graduate students looking for jobs in insane markets, how do you suggest that we can apply this principle to it? Thank you.
I mean, first of all, I feel like the 80-20 rule is everywhere these days, and it's gone way beyond consulting. I think the interesting thing is not the 80-20 rule itself. It's more of the question of what does the 80-20 rule actually mean? What it means is some elements have disproportionate sway over outcomes versus others, right? If I put in $1 here, I could get $3, I could get 1.5, and I could get 4, right? And so the question is really around if I think of the 80-20 rule, what it represents is one, understanding of where is there disproportionate value to be realized. And that can be in a business context, that can be in a life context, that can be in your morning routine context, right? Like if I wake up and I have 2 hours in my morning, what are the most important, valuable things that are going to set me up for my day in a better way? And the second part is it's not only important to understand what holds disproportionate kind of value, it's also important to ruthlessly prioritize once I have that understanding. And so to your point, when you kind of surface that, if I think of the job market and how you want to approach it, there's probably two benefits to the 80-20 rule. There is one, which is you thinking of it as a way to do work and distinguish yourself in the sort of work that you do. And so adopting this as a way to think in systems in any job that you have, asking yourself, not is this the way things have always been done, but is this the best way things can be done? The second part is around really how can you identify how your skill set, your expertise, your uniqueness as an individual provides you with disproportionate leverage in the job market. And this might sound very simplistic, but at McKinsey, sometimes we'd be hiring for certain jobs, or even at CVS, and we look at people's profiles, and a simple thing might distinguish them. For example, we have a client that is based in the Middle East, and that person has on their CV that they speak fluent Arabic. And so that can become a very nuanced edge for you, right? It's a place where you have disproportionate differentiation versus 300 other applicants that only speak English or English and French, for example. And so the way I would almost think of it is, as I look for jobs, I would ask myself, I guess, 2 or 3 questions. Number one, where does my differentiation lie, both in my personal experience, in my professional education, and in my work experience, right? And so that's like really important because it tells you how you are different. The second thing is, if I really am, and maybe not everyone wants to do that, but if I really want to be building the foundation for a long-term successful career, what have I observed are the roles that disproportionately rise to the top that I aspire to be at in 20 years. I'll give you an example. You might say my life's goal is to work for Google. And for many people, that is the goal, right? But then when you look at the sorts of roles that exist in Google, there are many, and not all of them rise to the top of the organization in the same way. For example, if you're a software engineer, you have good odds. If you're on the go-to-market, you have good odds. If you choose to be, for example, on, let's call it like the HR team, that's a structurally different value prop, right? You could rise to be the head of HR, but you might not be running the department. And so as you think of the 80-20 rules, you'll notice that the pools of talent that companies pull from are 20% of the workforce, but end up in 80% of the leadership roles for them. And so that's the second kind of important thing. First, what differentiates you? Two, what in the roles that you're observing tend to rise to the top? And then third is asking yourself in the macro trends of the market you exist in. Right now, one of the most used buzzwords is AI, for example. 10 years ago, it was cloud. 20 years ago, it was the web transition and web 2.0 and 1.0. And so the question becomes, what are the spaces that are going to be shaping the future of opportunity in the market? And so what are the 20% of types of companies, types of industries that are going to be influencing this down the line? And so those are maybe the three things in which I think the 80-20 rule, or, if you disaggregate it, where does leverage lie and how do I prioritize that, tend to be most helpful in both seeking the job, landing it, and succeeding in it.
Super. Thanks. Thanks, Cesar. She's coming. Okay, so Leora's coming, and she should have been sitting here, but she's staying out to be our support because we do everything at our desk, right? So thank you, Leora, for doing that as well.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Yazbeck, for giving us this chance to ask you questions. And my question is, last year, companies blamed AI for laying off 54,836 people. A lot of us students are scared it's gonna wipe out entry-level jobs. So my question here is, based on what you've seen, how should we set ourselves up so AI helps our career instead of hurting them?
Yeah.
I want to kind of like split that question into two parts. I know there's a lot of talk of AI-driven layoffs. Just objective observation outside in. Well, actually, not necessarily outside in, because I live in the space and I breathe it every day. I think there's a bit of mischaracterization of these layoffs, and I think a lot of the industry is putting this AI at the center of the reason why they're laying off, when the effective reason is maybe, very diverse and very different. And so I just want to spend a second here to say stories of AI replacing full jobs are significantly inflated in this moment. The reality is, and working and operating in the space, models are very good, but they are still very probabilistic. And over the next 5 to 10 years, what we're going to observe is not categories of jobs disappearing, but these jobs becoming hyper-productive. And then the question becomes, how is that hyper-productivity going to be translated into bottom line impact for companies, right? It can be translated into two ways. One way is, I need less people to do the same. That's a mindset of scarcity. There is also the mindset of plenty that says, now I can do 100x more with the same people. And we're not sure where the market is going to land. And you'll observe this in very diverse forms. So for example, at McKinsey, there's a lot of talk of, business analysts will no longer exist. Well, that's not necessarily true. What we're observing is the quality, depth, and comprehensiveness of deliverables is becoming much stronger. You're still staffing an associate partner, an engagement manager, and 3 business analysts. But then the bar was previously, we did a benchmarking exercise and understood what are the 10 companies that compete with us and what their prices are. That used to be the work of 3 weeks, for example. Now you can probably make that work using AI in 3 days. And the next 2.5 weeks are spent on competitive positioning, on differentiation, on the insights that come from understanding the market. And so I wanted to just anchor on that because I understand that as nearing, graduation now, there's a lot of concern about the job market. And I want to encourage you to break down this perspective that AI is stealing people's jobs. And specifically for you, highly qualified candidates, graduate studies from greatly differentiated and known universities, you will find places to land. Now, to the second part of your question, which is how can you leverage the technology? I go back to kind of one of the two biggest transitions we've had in the past, I think, 150 years, right? One was the Industrial Revolution, and two was the advent of the web. In both situations, you'll find that people that stuck to the legacy way of doing things went into one of two things. Either they became obsolete or they became high-end luxury products. And that's Hermes, right? They still do everything manually. They don't use machines. And that's a very particular wedge. But most became obsolete, right? And so what you'll see is in order to survive the wave, you need to surf the wave. You need to focus on educating yourself. AI literacy is super important. Focus on understanding not only how the tool is used generically, but also how it can be applied in your space. Orienting yourself to the markets that are most looking for the sort of talent that you're in and that are maybe the least early in their AI adoption journey. And that goes back to how you create leverage for yourself. If you graduate as, a graduate student from NYU with a strong undergrad and a good work experience, and you are a builder, you're familiar with, maybe Replit or Lovable or Cloud Code, and you're good at prompting and pushing the answer forward, then you can really create a very strong moat for yourself. And actually, you're still earlier in the journey of learning, and your mind and your brain is more kind of like elastic. So when you step into that world, you're going to be competing with people that have been in the space for 20 years, that have been set in their ways. And so it becomes a very good wedge for you to say, there's a new way of doing things. I bring the know-how of the space and the technological understanding of the future of the industry. And thus, I can not only contribute, but I can also lead. And so that's what I would encourage the most. But I would go back to the first point. Don't be too afraid of the AI transformation. It's been materially overinflated. It will take many more years to happen, actually.
Thanks. We'll speak more about it. If things are going well, I feel bad what you have to leave you. Was it okay? People.
Yes,
Yeah,
it is.
right. Excellent. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Totally.
Thank you, Dr. Yazbeck. Thank you for joining us today. And my question is about habit in a job place. And so I saw in McKinsey's Leadership Factories research that companies get a 37% competency boost just from habits like coaching and feedback. So from your career, what's the one habit that really separates smart students from true leaders in a high pressure place like McKinsey? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we always try to tag numbers to coaching and feedback. It's really hard. The 37%, it passes the sniff test, but I feel like even if it didn't provide any upside, if you want to create a distinguished kind of like work environment, a place where people want to be, one big thing that I've observed in my time at McKinsey versus my time at CVS is truly coaching, but not only coaching, specifically feedback is something that people crave. It's something that people crave because it's the feedback loop that gives you almost either validation or guidance or course correction on how you can do better. And so I think it's just a core part of any culture that I've stepped into. If I am in a leadership role, I like to foster an open environment where collaboration, coaching, and feedback is truly at the core. Now, to your question of what's one habit that really separates the people? I would say, like, I don't want to say it like smart students from true leaders. I want to say it from like the people that rise fast versus the people that have a lower slope of progression, right? And so I'll start by saying, like, I think everyone that works in McKinsey has a baseline level of smart, right? Like, you need to be able to crack the business case. You need to be able to, speak to what a P&L is and, costs and revenues and be able to understand them and disaggregate them. You need to be able to run a good interview, right? And do like almost like a diagnostic approach of how to hone in on the problem. You need to be able to run a client conversation. So these kind of like, in the McKinsey context, at least, commoditized goods are really hard to differentiate yourself on. Like, you could be 5% smarter than everyone else, and that could translate in like a 5% better outcome, but that's not what's going to make you a senior partner versus like a partner in like 16 years. What I've observed to be the true differentiator is ownership. And I think ownership is often very simply defined as independence. And that is, I think, where people fall short. Ownership is structurally very different than independence. And that's where people confound it. So I'll give you a very practical example. Let's say you are given a task to go determine how a procurement function should look like for a Middle Eastern airline. It's a very specific example because I had to do that like in summer of 2016, right? There's two ways to do this. There's my manager gave me this task. In order to show ownership, I need to go do it all end to end and come back with an answer. And then there is the definition of ownership that says, I am the owner of the problem and the owner and accountable person to get to the better answer. I know for a fact that I am not the best person to own this end to end. I am comfortable leading the thinking and the work on 80%, pulling in an expert for an interview to get their input, delegating an action to my manager to send the client an email because we need this data, and escalating in problem solving a challenge that we have with the partner. A lot of times, people will confuse ownership with not doing any of that because it shows dependency on others. But the true definition of ownership is owning the journey to the answer, not owning the totality of the answer. And so pulling in people, being able to orchestrate people and use them to their strength, whether they're your superiors, your peers, your clients, is where I've seen people really differentiate themselves and get to a materially better answer, regardless of whether they're smarter or their work ethic is harder or they talk better, right? And so that's what I've seen as a common thread across all of the people that rise to roles of leadership. They lead by leading, they don't lead by insulating and doing things in a box and focusing on it on their own.
Super. Thanks very much. Bye.
Hi, Dr. Yazbeck. Thank you for joining us here today and sharing your perspective and stories on all of these different topics that we are bringing to you. And I also want to thank Dr. Benaroya for introducing us to you and connecting to a professional that has such a wide range of wealth of experience that we can learn from today. My question is related to like the exposure you've gained throughout your career. You've held many different positions and it's related to that. So McKinsey, as we know, spans 65 countries around the world. And that level, I just want to ask, like, what did that level of exposure teach you that medical training could not? And on more of a personal level, is it true that that experience like involved a lot of traveling, and even when it was not always easy or enjoyable?
Okay, I'll start with the easy part of this question, which is traveling is definitely, there's definitely a lot of traveling, and it's definitely not always fun. I'll be the first person to say that. But I found that the mindset with which you approach travel is really important. And I think, if you can shape it around the idea of purposeful presence, of in-person collaboration, but also the idea of experiencing something new, testing a new culture, a new geography, a new environment, a new, sort of conversation. You'd be very surprised by how different just a random coffee shop conversation looks in the US versus in France versus in Saudi versus in India, right? Like, just it's so deeply rooted in the culture. And so to me, it was, I mean, I spent like, I think for a period of time, 3 months flying on Sunday at 4 a.m. Because the work week in the Middle East was Sunday to Thursday. And so that definitely wasn't fun, right? But I always find a way to energize myself and to say, like, this is for a good reason, and I'm going to make the best out of it. And I think this mindset can be really good. I personally always try to look at what do I stand to gain from something. I find that in our mind, our biggest challenge to delivering on something is our mind. If we speak positive thoughts to ourselves and we reinforce positive perspectives, then we will create positive experiences. And so I just started with that kind of like point on travel, which sounds mundane, but having, I think, done more than 1,000 flights in the span of like 6, 7 years at McKinsey, I can tell you it can become a burden. To your first point, I think they're so different as experiences, McKinsey and my clinical training, and I would maybe compare them to like a very broad, shallow lake and a very narrow and deep crevice. Medical training was truly very focused in the sorts of people you engage with. It was, a very narrow kind of type of persona, like the professors, the doctors, the kind of like nurses, the patients. Typically, you're also practicing in a specific space. And so, let's say rheumatology or ENT or whatever it may be. And so even the sorts of situations you see are very similar and comparable. But also the mindset is very executive. What do I mean by that? It is an execution path. So patient shows up with A, recommended path is B, the optimal test is C, and the most likely diagnosis is D. And so it's a very algorithmic approach also for 90% of the time. Versus my experience in McKinsey was very different. It was, you don't necessarily go into the depth of diagnosing a person, but you get exposed to 20 countries, 30 companies, 500 different employees, out of which there's 20 different functions, from finance to HR to operations to strategy to whatever it may be, right? And so you start seeing that it's a very different form of engagement. It's a very focused, medical training is very focused. This is much more of context switching, moving from one problem to the other. It's much more brief because you have engagements of 2, 3 months. And then I think the final thing that I'll reflect on is, if you think of the healthcare system, at the risk of like a very, out there analogy, think of an army. In an army, there are the ones that make the decisions, and then there are the ones that execute the orders. At its simplest, physicians and nurses are frontline providers that are executing the guidance of a system. It's very hard for a provider to become the decision maker in a system. And yes, I mean, a lot of them do, right? But as far as like percentile wise, very few of them make it to that decision making position. Versus if you take a step back, the regulators, the health systems, the insurance companies, they're truly shaping the way the space operates. And then kind of like that shapes the experience of the doctors. And so getting that chance at McKinsey allowed me to really understand how the generals that are shaping the space are guiding it, and how the system operates. Where is their opportunity? As a doctor, you're always thinking of your patient, and that's super important. As a person running the health system, you're thinking, I have 5 operating rooms. Should I make it 6 or should I make it 4? And that's a very structurally different question than, should I do an operation for Mrs. Smith on her left hip replacement? Right? That decision depends on whether there's 5, 6, or 4 ORs. And so you're kind of thinking much more macro. And you're aggregating all of these signals from all of these doctors, from all of this market, and from the financial implications of it and the regulatory implications, and asking, how can I design a better system? And so I feel like both experiences were invaluable. One gave me the human touch, one showed me the challenges of what healthcare delivery looks like, and the other gave me the systems level thinking to be able to look at things and say, if we want to change that experience, those are the levers we should be touching in order to design a better healthcare system.
Super. Thanks very much.
Hi, Mr. Yazbeck. This is Young, and really great to have you here today. And my question is related to the AI and the doctor's daily practice, clinical practice. So the American Medical Association survey shows that AI use among doctors is rising, but much of it is still focused on the research summaries, documentation, and other support tasks rather than the major frontline clinical change. And my mom is a physician in China, and I still do not see AI making too much difference in her daily outpatient work. So from your perspective, why is there still such a gap between the growing AI adoption and real change in everyday clinical practice?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I would say the adoption of AI in healthcare can be defined in many ways. There is patient use of chatbots, Gen AI capabilities to educate themselves and test out their understanding. And that speaks to, patients' want and need for further clarity around their care. There is the doctor's use of what I would call admin or diagnosis support capabilities. So, open evidence, for example, stepping in to help differential diagnosis, or ambient scribes listening into the conversation and transcribing it, right? And then there's the third, and I think that's where the true opportunity lives. It's in reimagining the healthcare system in an AI-powered way, in doing AI-powered staffing, deployment, perioperative scheduling, prior authorization, and really changing the way the workflows of healthcare operate, right? And I think we hear a lot about AI adoption among physicians. What this essentially means is doctors are using like a healthcare specific ChatGPT, which is like maybe open evidence, to like test the symptoms and see the differential diagnosis, or they're using like a transcription tool to listen to their conversation and then write the notes, right? And that's really like the superficial level of AI adoption. I work with a lot of the largest health systems. I've worked at CVS Health, where we have a huge care delivery organization. What I can tell you is these organizations are still asking themselves, where is it even worth investing in AI to do this? And so this is going back to the initial question we had earlier of 58,346, was it, that were kind of like laid off? Like, yes, but it's still significantly overblown. Now, talking practically, what stands in the way? If you look at what getting to an AI-powered health system requires, what does it require? It requires, number one, and most importantly, data that lives in the cloud. And there's hundreds, if not thousands, of organizations that still store their information on premise, right? Like they haven't even gone through the cloud transformation. Now, we live in hubs, right? You live in New York, which is one of the global capitals of the world, San Francisco, one of the tech capitals. And so we tend to, in that bubble, observe that somehow AI is everywhere. But if you take a trip to Atlanta, to Cincinnati, to Buenos Aires, to Beijing, I mean, no, Beijing is probably like a huge hub, but like I correct myself and say like, Beirut, because I'm from there, right? Like it's just such an ancillary thought that's completely side to the core of things, right? And so you have most companies don't even have their data on the clouds for them to be able to tap into it. Number two is for AI to operate effectively, you don't only need the data to be in one place, you also need it to be clean, standardized, and unified. And a lot of organizations, I can name the 3 top health systems in the US right now, like the systems that people travel from all around the world to get treatment at, that don't have their data unified and standardized in one place. So their data is not in the right place. Their data is not unified. So that's 2 layers of maturity that are missing. The third layer that's missing is once you unify your data, you need to convert it from an asset to a brain. And so you need to tell yourself, not all of my data is in one place because that's useless. You need to also tell yourself, how does this data relate to each other, right? How does the patient relate to the doctor, relate to the revenue, relate to the appointment availability? This ontology turns a static neuron. The best analogy I can say is maybe if you take a human brain, right? A human brain has, let's say, 5 million neurons. And then a snail has 1 neuron. Are 5 million snails as smart as one human? No. But the number of neurons is the same. So what's the difference? The difference is the networks that these neurons build together that are able to compound complex thinking versus each neuron firing on its own and not really doing anything, right? It's just doing the same thing again and again because it's a binary thing. And so turning your data from 5 million snails to one brain that is the compounded sum of these 5 million neurons is a much harder task to do. Only then are you ready to deploy artificial intelligence in a way that actually changes outcomes, that is not like a gimmick, right? And so when we talk about doctors' experiences, it's so many layers of maturity that are missing, not from the doctors, but from the system that is seeking to create that experience for doctors that they need to go on that journey for. And then I'll end by saying I'm obviously overgeneralizing because not all organizations are at this level of maturity. But again, we in the hub see the organizations that rise to the top, that are talking about this loudly, and we think everyone else is following course. But the reality is less than 1% of organizations are at this degree of maturity. And these are the places where you see adoption rising. But in reality, the 99% are still on that journey. And the same way you look at the web adoption and how it took 20 years for some companies, and now still some companies don't have a good website. You look at the cloud transition and you see that after 15 years of the cloud becoming a thing, you still have more than 50% of companies not having cloud native data. The AI transformation is going to be one of early adopters, then a wave of adoption when things become more commoditized and approachable, and then a long tail of laggers that are going to follow. And so this is to say, your mom is probably going to get the chance to use AI pretty soon, but I wouldn't want to put AI that hinders her experience in her hands too early because the downside there is much higher than we're willing to accept.
Super. Thanks very much. And thanks for doing this. Happens to be on both sides of
Thank the camera.
Yeah. Perfect.
Hi, my name is Candice, and good afternoon, Ms. Yazbeck, and thank you for giving us a chance to ask questions. So my question is, McKinsey and Miller often moves into the management into cross business operations in more than 20 countries in different industries. And from a graduate student's perspective, how does this kind of career path can help you port new business opportunities and prepare for leadership?
Yeah, I find this like is very, I guess, like intimately tied to what do you learn at McKinsey that makes it worth the trouble of being at McKinsey. You know, and I don't want to use McKinsey in that sense. I'll just use like consulting as an industry, right? Consulting as an industry is a very challenging one, and folks would not invest their careers in it if there's no clear, I guess, like playbook for what you gain out of it. And I'll say it in like, I think there's maybe 3 things that are really important. One is the problem-solving approach, which comes hand in hand with top-down communication, right? Which is if you can take a problem and deductively disaggregate it into all its components, right? Or take all the components and build up that pyramid. That is a very core and important skill because it's a very versatile skill, right? It's one that can be applicable to anything from your everyday life to your job, to your relationships, and at the risk of making it a bit too broad, but it can serve, right? Like if you, even in a relationship level, if someone acts in a certain way, instead of reacting to their actions, you ask yourself, why are they acting in this way? And you figure out the 3 reasons for this, then you can be a much more thoughtful partner or friend or whatever it may be, right? But then that problem-solving approach is like a really core part. Disaggregating a problem, it's building blocks and figuring out where the answer lies. The second is your ability to orchestrate and communicate large groups of people. And so, operating as almost like a hub with many spokes and delegating, pulling in input. And this is what I spoke about earlier, which is like the true definition of ownership that McKinsey teaches you at a very, very kind of like aggressive pace early on in your career, if you're willing to learn it. And then third is, I think, that idea of systems level thinking, which is if I look at a linear journey, right? I think in chemistry, they used to always say like the rate limiting step. I don't know if anyone took organic chemistry. I still remember it. There's always a step that dictates the pace at which a reaction happens. And in order to accelerate that step, you need to identify the step and then put in a catalyst. That catalyst it unblocks the issue. Systems level thinking is essentially that. It's saying, okay, why is revenue not going up? Okay, it can be because we're not producing enough. It could be because there's not enough demand. It could be because our channels are different. It could be our supplier is not getting us enough raw materials. And you might, as a leader that doesn't think in systems, think, oh, I need to spend on marketing. Well, no, actually, the issue is your manufacturer is 6 weeks late on delivering the batch, and that's not the issue. So that systems level thinking is like the third element that I think is super important to your differentiation as a talent in the job market. And so, the journey in consulting, if you nail these 3 things, problem solving, effective communication, orchestration, and systems level thinking, you are setting yourself up to be truly more productive, more competent, and rising faster than anyone else, because you truly bring, again, in the 80-20 context, differentiated value. You're one person that can deliver significantly more than many. And that becomes what your kind of brand is in a way, which is why you see that pattern of founders and executive leaders coming from consulting.
Super. Thanks for that. And I wanted to tackle now another problem. I know that's, the participants that we have people from companies, folks that I know, chief human resources officers and other. And, the challenge that we have now is that when you look at the numbers in the US, 1 out of 2 employees changes jobs per year. In some companies, somewhere between 30% to 80% of candidates don't show up to the interview. About 60% of candidates don't accept the offer. And we know that both in the US and in the UK, 67% of employees admit that the reason why they say they couldn't go to work wasn't true. Now, what we're doing here is encouraging students to take another class. So students enroll in this class, and 4 months before they start the class, I tell them that they will be better off taking the class with another professor. There are 18 other professors, because in this class, you're not allowed to be absent ever. You're not allowed to be late ever, and you are not allowed to have the phone or the PC on your desk. Now, if we go to the stats in New York City, about 500,000 trains are late every year. And yet, we're now at the end of the semesters, and for all the students that you see here, they were never absent, they were never late, and they were never on their phones and things like that. So if you're an employer, why would you take the risk to hire someone else if you could hire one of them? Cesar, any comments on that?
No, I would agree. I would say, like, personally, when I'm making hiring decisions, I look at things slightly differently than, I guess, what I've observed my peers do. I always ask myself, first of all, I mean, let's assume there's a clear role, definition, etc. Like I always ask myself, what is coachable versus what is innate? And I think, if you look at the talent pool that's available to employers in the US and broader, there's a lot of competent people. And I've actually observed that on-paper competence does not have as strong of a correlation to on-job performance as I thought. Strangely enough, my wife and I talk about this because we both end up spending quite a bit of our time in executive roles hiring. And what we've observed is when you're doing the behavioral part of the conversation, the most important thing to us is seeing the fire inside the person and them wanting to be here, wanting to step in, to deliver, to participate, and to kind of be part of the journey of what we're building. And so to your point, oftentimes, the point of being late, oftentimes you will use tools or processes to justify failure. And so to make it real, like someone that shows up 5 minutes late would be like, I am sorry, my train was late. I understand that. It is a fair answer. The question is, have you lived in New York for a while? Yes. Are you familiar with how trains operate? Yes. New York trains are always late. Now, yes, there might have been an exceptional situation where you got stuck in a train for 45 minutes. I'm not going to go there. Yes. But let's take the median scenario, which is the train was normally late. That is something that you could have accounted for. And so are you taking ownership of the process or are you taking ownership of the outcome? Because the process is I am taking control of my commute to work. The outcome is I'm taking ownership of showing up on time. And they are very different mindsets. We disproportionately look for the people that show up on time regardless of anything. Obviously, I'm using show up on time as an analogy. There is no you need to show up at 9 a.m. in our job. It's not that. But I'm using it conceptually, right? We want the people that are solving back from the outcome, then from the starting point and hoping the outcome realizes. And so in the conversations and in work, you'll see that there's two ways to navigate these kind of challenges. One is you really try to, but it doesn't necessarily work out. And the other is you pre-plan, and if things are going to go sideways, you escalate, right? Hey, professor, I apologize. There is this situation, Grand Central, I'm stuck for 30 minutes. I will be there. I want you to know that I left on time, right? That's an acceptable answer. But you escalated, you communicated, you created transparency. And 99% of the time, you do make it work. And so this is just to say, Professor, what you're instilling is accountability towards outcomes, not accountability towards process. And I think that's a core ingredient for why being successful in the corporate environment depends on that, and why you'll notice in senior roles of leadership, people don't care about what you've done. If you show up to an executive leadership team meeting and you say, oh, we've interviewed 500 people and we've shortlisted 200, no one cares. What they'll ask you is, your hiring target is 10 people. How many people have accepted a job offer and have a set start date? So executive level accountability is on the outcomes. Junior level accountability needs to be reshaped around outcomes because oftentimes people take ownership of the process, not the outcome. And so to your point, if any of you are interested in Invisible or want to understand more about how to get into McKinsey or CVS, I'm always happy to connect, whether it's on LinkedIn or by email or in a brief 15-minute chat, and share how at least I can be helpful in that journey.
Super. Thanks so much, Cesar.
He's already gone.
Oh, he's already gone. So sorry. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, Leonil, sorry. Yeah, I forgot.
Hi, Mr. Yazbeck. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Lei Danielle, and my question speaks to your expertise in leadership. So according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, employment of medical and health services managers are projected to grow much faster than average, which means the field is only getting more important. What do you think is the biggest mistake you see graduate students or early career health service strategists make
when they try to turn that opportunity into real impact? And would you say the same advice holds up for us in marketing too?
I like this question because it has like an implied question within it. Why is the job market for healthcare growing? It's actually growing because we live in a society where the average population is aging. We live in an aging population where, birth rates are going down, people are living longer, and thus long-term medical care is needed, right? And so that trend is unlikely to change. What might change is we might become suddenly, in some surprising twist of fate, much more productive at delivering care. I don't see that happening anytime soon, but I guess you can consider that this trend that we're observing is going to persist over the next 10 to 15 years. What I've observed, people, not necessarily, I don't like to call it mistakes. I think where folks tend to narrow their focus a bit more than necessary is there's two types of job seekers. There are the job seekers that will look at an industry and be like, that industry is growing, and thus I want to be in it, right? And that is a narrow pool. It is a big pool. It's an industry, right? But it's a narrow pool. And there are those that think, again, back to thinking in systems, that think healthcare is an industry in itself that has dependency on 4 to 5 other industries. There needs to be doctors that are trained and nurses that are trained. There needs to be gloves and medical devices that are manufactured. There needs to be insurance companies that are operating. There needs to be regulators that are overseeing this. There needs to be a non-governmental organizational ecosystem that can support those that can't. There is a capital investment and construction industry that needs to build the clinics and the hospitals. And even within that, there's a specific requirement for HVAC systems that needs to be deployed in hospitals. And so suddenly you've taken a trend of healthcare as an industry is growing and extrapolated it to the second degree implications of there are 7 to 8 other industries that have core dependencies on healthcare growing, and thus are going to benefit from the tailwinds of that growth in healthcare. And so as you look to shape your career and find a role, you might say, well, I want to piggyback on that growth in healthcare, but I don't necessarily see myself working in a hospital. I could totally go do lead up marketing for a B2B clinic construction company that specializes in sanitized ORs, for example. I could lead B2C marketing for a wellness and longevity tool, because we know that as healthcare spend goes up and complexity goes up, people are thinking about how to stay healthy and investing in their health and their vitamins and their workouts, right? And so this is kind of like what I'm trying to surface here is think not only of the first degree implication of healthcare jobs are going to go up, but think of the 6 to 7 other types of industries that are going to benefit from that, and which one resonates most with how you differentiate yourself and where you would like to play, and then focus on that. And that's basically where I see missed opportunities, not necessarily mistakes.
Cesar, thanks so much. I know that the time is up, but we have 4 more questions. Is there a chance that we could extend it for a few more minutes?
Yes, I can go for another 10 or I guess I can go up until the 10:15 time.
Okay,
Well,
let's go.
10:15 my time.
Yeah. 10 more minutes. Okay, so thanks so much for doing that. Yeah. So wait.
Hi, I'm Ashley, and thank you for coming here, Mr. Yazbeck. Your answer is really helpful and really inspiring. My question is related to how to be a good analyst. The National Association of Colleagues and Employers Job Outlook says the employers keep ranking problem solving and analytic skills at the top, but a lot of students, we still have trouble turning that into the actual business results. And in your experience at McKinsey and CVS, what's the biggest mistake young analysts make when they try to apply an analysis to the real problems? And what do the strongest people do differently? Thank you.
Yeah, of course. I feel like I've already spoken at length about the problem-solving approach and all of that, so I won't spend more time on this. But I do think that there is, how can I say this? There are answers that are right and wrong at the same time. And what I've observed is you can nail the problem solving part, you can nail the analytics part, but if you're solving a problem on paper, not in the real world, you'll still be blind to the right answer, the true right answer. And the reason I say this is I feel like we've all had this like math question when we were kids, which is, you know, if Andrew has 2 watermelons and Sophia has one watermelon, and Sophia gave Andrew 1 watermelon, how many watermelons is Andrew going to eat? And the on paper answer is Andrew's going to eat 3 watermelons. The real answer is no human can eat 3 watermelons. He's probably going to eat half of it, right? And that's the difference between solving a problem on paper and solving it in the real world. And that's like the biggest kind of thing that I observe in, like folks that are smart and sharp and eager and they want to do the work and they're pushing the solution and we'll come to it. And, like we'll talk about like, I don't know, like how many iPhones are going to be sold in the US next year, right? Or in the next 20 years. And an analyst will look at like, they'll do the academic exercise really well. They'll look at the past 20 years and they'll say, oh, the average growth rate has been 3%. And thus, assuming this projects into the future 20 years, we suspect that there are going to be 450 million iPhones sold in America. Okay, how many humans are there in America? There's 330. So like, are we assuming every person has like almost 2 of them? So you start realizing that there is a difference between the theory of cracking the problem and the practice of thinking of the constraints that help me fine-tune my real assumptions, but that might not project into the future real, right? Maybe my production capacity could never keep up. Maybe even to make the iPhone example much more believable, you could say we will sell 160 million iPhones, but then you look at the plant capacity for Apple and you'll be like, well, at best they can produce 120 million iPhones. And actually, even if they built a new factory, cobalt supply from Congo cannot keep up with the demand, and thus we will never reach 150 million iPhones, right? That is a real world solution. That is the gap of questioning each assumption and going back in its, supply chain, in its system itself, and questioning it. Is it believable? Is it real? Where I see analysts not necessarily always have the 360 view.
Super, thanks, Juan. Very good. The few of you could come up. That way we save a tiny bit of time. We go one by one. So yeah, you go first.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Youngberg, for giving us the chance to ask the questions. I would like to ask across McKinsey, CVS, and now Invisible, how do you decide whether AI initiative is actually worth funding, not just interesting on paper, but strong enough financially to scale? And what metrics or decision points do you trust most when the payoff is too uncertain at the start? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's I feel like this question has a lot of uncertainty in it because, like, to put it simply, right? Like, if you take the playbook of like procurement transformation in a pharma company, the approach is relatively structured. What do I mean by that? Like, there's been enough procurement transformations in pharma that now there is a best-in-class playbook that says typically how we approach these things is you do this first, that first, and these are typically the 5 places where value lives. And so we are now dealing with a space, the artificial intelligence space, where there's still not that recipe doesn't exist yet, right? We are still in like the exploration of where could value live. And so your question is, I think, very valid because a lot of executives are wrangling with the idea of, the best class way to build a go-to-market function is clear, right? In a B2B SaaS context, for example. But the best way to AI power like recruitment or whatever, perioperative scheduling, it's not clear yet. And is it even a use case that's going to exist in the future? And what is the best in class going to look like? And so that's like it's something that folks really think about. And you'll notice there's 3 archetypes of people that think of this as clients, because I talk to them every day about this. The first one are the cost-cutting people. they're very ROI oriented, right? They're thinking, for me to invest in an AI use case, you need to tell me how many people I'm going to be able to fire afterwards. And these tend to be the worst clients because they are approaching the artificial intelligence revolution with a mindset of scarcity, the mindset of substitute human for machine, and you can only substitute that many humans. Again, I would recommend anyone to Google the IBM quote from, I think, the late 80s or 90s when Deep Blue was playing chess with Garry Kasparov. It said, no computer should ever make a decision because a computer cannot be held accountable. And so this idea of removing humans, I think, is not the future where artificial intelligence is, but that's the first archetype. The second archetype is, how do you make me a superhuman? What is the art of the possible? What is the upside? What do I stand to gain from this, right? And so that, I think, is a much more appealing model. It's a much more pragmatic one. It's looking at, could I do better at this? Could I do better at that? And the KPIs can be operational or financial. That, I think, is a very good way to approach it. And third are the visionaries, the people that are not thinking in numbers, they're thinking in vision. They are thinking the future of the space as I imagine it will be is that. It's the thinking that Steve Jobs had in the early 2000s when he said, I don't want a keyboard. In a world of BlackBerries, where people loved the click of their BBM, right? He went up and he said, no keyboards, just a screen. Was there a business case? There was absolutely no business case. There was a thesis, there was a vision, there was validation with humans, of course, but these are like watershed moments in the space that exist that cannot be dictated by numbers. That's the third archetype. That's my favorite archetype because that's when you're going on a discovery journey with the client. You're not thinking in the realm of the immediate. You're thinking in the realm of revisiting how this entirely operates.
Thank you. Look, I feel real bad with you two guys, but why don't you both ask a question one after the other? That way, at least you guys get to ask a question, right? And then we'll see how we manage in 3 minutes. So Benaroya will be first, and then Dario.
So, Mr. Yazbeck, thank you so much again for extending your time and letting us ask you these questions. My question for you today is, many people are worried about changing careers. So what made you decide to leave the medical field and move into a more business-focused role? And what was it that made you stay once you made that shift? Thanks.
And then Dario.
My question is regarding being like international candidate in the US. So what was the toughest challenge you faced as international candidate during the transition, and how did you overcome it? And also, as someone who sponsors international talent, what advantages do international companies like McKinsey, CVS, and Invisible find in hiring international students, and did you overcome it? Thank you.
Yeah, I'll start with the first one very briefly. I'll say I don't think I left the medical field. I think I transitioned to a different focus. I still keep my medical training and my practice at the core of, who I see myself as a person. I would say my transition came from, I would call it maybe constructive dissatisfaction, which is I looked at how doctors operated in the health space and the experience that patients got out of healthcare. And I saw a lot that's broken. And I asked myself in my everyday, do I have a practical way to fix it? And I found that as a physician, as a practicing physician, I would never be able to shape the upstream things that make this healthcare experience dissatisfying to both providers and patients. And that was the big genesis behind why I wanted to step into that space. Since I've made that transition, I have personally never looked back because I feel very fulfilled in the sort of problems and solutions that I've brought. I feel like I've had a much larger macro impact than I would have had as a patient. As a physician treating patients. And I know that distance to impact is a real thing. It's very instantly gratifying to treat a patient. It is very delayed gratification to remove prior authorization for knee x-rays. But the reality is removing prior authorization for knee x-rays, despite it sounding way less quote unquote sexy as a thing to do versus treating someone for knee pain, it allowed more than 100,000 patients that are treated by Aetna to get an x-ray 1 week earlier than they would have otherwise. And these are the micro parts of the healthcare journey that encourage me to stay focused on the macro side, not the kind of like knowing that it has an implication on the patient side, but is not necessarily a direct gratification of treating a patient. And then to the question around, I guess, like the international experience, I'm curious to if I can ask you guys a question. How many of you are international students? If you can just raise your hands. Okay. How many of you identify as expats versus identify as immigrants? I think that's like a very important delineation. We often think that, you know, someone from the US going to the UK is an expat, but someone moving from Lebanon or India or China to the US is an immigrant. I encourage you to break down that barrier. You are not an immigrant. You are an expat. Your home exists. Your community exists. Your people are there. And that's the first thing that I changed in my approach, which is I am not immigrating to the US. I am an expat in the US. I am Cesar, the Lebanese person that grew up there, that has their community and their culture. I just happen to exist here. That's just culturally really helpful to frame me being in this society, right? It empowers me to say, I am not seeking this. I am taking advantage of an opportunity that I have created for myself. I chose to be here. No one told me to be here. So I think that's like a really important mindset. Then on the job side, I actually, in my entire career, I've probably interviewed 600 candidates and filled probably more than like 100 to 150 roles. I have never, ever in my life asked HR to filter applications by immigration status. I believe in pure opportunity, and whatever the implication is, we will. So like even when we had a situation where during the $100,000 H-1B tax, our company wanted to hold off on hiring, you know, people that would need H-1B. And I personally made the decision that I know this is recommended, but I will not. I believe this will be resolved and I will not impact my pipeline. And I ended up extending an offer to a young graduate of, you know, that's from India, but studying in California. And it was the only job he got. And it was 6 months away from when his OPT would expire. And actually, he was one of the highest performers. And I was very happy that he got this opportunity. So as to say, like, the ethos of recruiting that I come to is, you know, your immigration status is irrelevant. You as a human is what matters. Everything outside of it, I don't want it to impact, right? And then third is, how can you navigate this? I think, you know, I cannot dictate what the market says, right? There will be companies that don't appreciate international exposure as much as possible, or as much as, you know, the organizations that I work at do. But try to use it as a strength. Try to think, what does your background give you that differentiates you? For example, you know, my friend works for the Ant Group, which I think owns Alibaba and kind of that entire group. She is an expat. The core differentiation for her was she speaks Cantonese and Mandarin, right? So like, you have assets that your expat status gives you. Find the place where you are valued. Turn what the market tells you is a handicap into an opportunity, and don't settle for the sorts of jobs that are trying to silo you. Ask, and always ask, what is the path to an H-1B if you're on OPT? Understand from previous people that work at the company, if you have connections on LinkedIn or friends or whatever, what has your journey been there? Post H-1B, how do they approach the green card process? Just, of course, it's depending on your goals, right? But then, you know, use that as part of your due diligence in the job. And what you'll find is there's a lot of opportunity. Not all opportunities are equal. Some places will appreciate you and value that you bring difference. The other places, instead of trying to fight the handicap to reach the ground level of what they consider an international student versus a local talent to be, it might not be the right position for you to be in because you will feel riskier and not as compelled to be part of it. But I think that's kind of like my takeaway from that, I guess.
Super. We have a video, but I think that we will show you because I'm worried that you won't have time. I haven't learned so much in 1 hour. I'll send you the video. It's something that Lynn did with all the students. So thank you. But this has been great, Cesar. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you. And I know you had, dozens and dozens of companies and opportunities. I appreciate that you trusted me with being part of this conversation. I hope it was helpful. I will reiterate my call to say, if you would like to connect via email, via LinkedIn, or just connect for, a 10-15-minute chat, I'm always happy to chat. Yes, I'm here to be helpful, and please feel free to reach out.
Super. Thanks again.